The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming out to be here at this time for the next 45 minutes or however long that we take. It's a beautiful day outside. That early fall, I think, is coming. And you chose to be here, so I appreciate that. What I'd like to do is go through the book and looking at it in various kinds of ways from a couple of different perspectives. I'll tell you something about both the author, Erika Hayasaki, and also the professor of this course, Dr. Norma Bowe. And then I'll talk some about narrative journalism as this being an exemplary expression of that from Erika Hayasaki. So I'll tell you some things about narrative journalism itself. If you're not familiar with that term, I'll read some excerpts from the book, not long chapters and pages at the most. I think the longest is maybe 2 paragraphs, but some to give you an example not only of her writing and the style and so forth, but sort of what the book is like, and especially as it demonstrates some things about it. Then I'll tell you some about the course itself, this 3-credit undergraduate course at Keene University in Union, New Jersey. About a 20 or 30 minute ride out from Manhattan. Just what the course actually is, at least in its course description, and then how it turns out to be something radically more than that. And then I will talk some about some of the major characters, so to speak, in this book. When I use the word character, though, I don't want you to think this is a book of fiction. It is not a book of fiction. In fact, I think one of the powers of nonfiction, and certainly that comes through a book like this, is to be able to say in the end, and it's all true. It actually happened. These people actually went through these lives that they lived and said these things and interacted and so forth. So the character, again, don't be confused by that. And then maybe I'll wrap up with hitting some themes that would have come out before that. I would clarify too that what John said, or what Joe said too, about when I retired, and the few years before I retired, I was thinking about going into spirituality-based work, and did think about going to seminary at 64, 65. It wasn't so much the age itself, it was the fact of 4 more years of student loans and graduate tuition, graduate courses, because an MDiv, a traditional degree, is basically a doctorate in terms of credits. It's 80 to 90 credits without a dissertation requirement and so forth. We're taking 4 years. And I have a doctorate in history, and I was talking to my dissertation supervisor one day over lunch about this, and I was all excited about this. I think I'm going to do this. And I've been accepted to a couple of places, and he listened very patiently with a little smile that he usually had, a great friend and supporter. And at the end he said, "Well, Bill, that's all interesting, but you do remember what it's like being a graduate student, don't you?" And that was the other reason I said, "You're right, I don't want to do another graduate program." So I found other ways to do work in various other kinds of pastoral ministry as a certified lay minister in the Methodist Church, as well as a chaplain at Albany Med, and doing other things. I found that sort of level and niche of my own. I think you all have this handout. Excuse me, I have one of those. I'm not contagious. I just have one of those upper respiratory little tickles that come every now and then. You have this handout front and back, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it other than just to sort of show you what it is and refer you to a couple of interesting things. The death class site itself gives a lot of information, has links to various things. The link that's there for Dr. Norma Bowe, actually, I have inconsistent luck with that. Sometimes it connects and sometimes it doesn't. You can also, her site is just normabo.com anyway. But you can find her at another site called centerforgriefservices.com. You can also, you'll see down here, there's a 3-minute video news release from Simon & Schuster about the course that shows video from the course and various activities they do, walking around a labyrinth and various things, and they have a couple of comments from students. That is also at the Death Class site, so that's worth looking at too. And then you can hear and see some interviews with Norma Bowe and Erika Hayasaki at NPR and MSNBC. I've given you those websites. And on the back, in sort of light color, I'm not necessarily going to go through every one of these things in order, but it sort of gives you an idea of actually what the book is about. The Death Class is kind of vague itself, but you think about, oh, it's just a lot of reading and discussions and lectures about death in needing numbers of ways. I think some of my courses I used to teach, I think the students call them death classes. But this course is going to be the death of me yet, or something like that, or this is so boring. But that's a different thing. But as I said, it turns out to be, and you just kind of follow along here, it turns out to be a lot about several dramatic, traumatic, horrific kinds of stories that some of these students have in their lives, and what that has sort of meant. It's a book about mental illness and violence and addictions. It's about suicide and murders in these stories, of these Norma's own story, as well as in the stories of some of her students. It's a book about survival and coming to some sort of resolution and moving on. It's a book about numbers of things, as well as the experiences of the class itself. We'll look at this on the very front page, the Death in Perspective course description. The past, present, and future individual and societal concepts of dying, death, and bereavement, death education, and exploration of related ethical issues. A field trip is required. Actually, it turns out to be several field trips that I'll describe a little bit later that the students actually take. And that's, I had to laugh when I saw that course description, because that's a very good example of a very typical generic course description. Because you just want to say, well, this is about this generally, and it's not about other things, and then that gives you a lot of freedom to sort of create the course that you want from one semester to the next. And certainly what she's done with this course goes far beyond that. Let me tell you a little bit about the two of them. The magnet character around which so much sort of is attached to her is Norma Bowe. She was trained as a nurse, extensive experiences in several different types of intensive care units, in ERs in various ways, and in hospices. And then she sort of went into health education with a master's in community health and health administration and a doctorate in community health policy. And she is in the College of Education now at Keene University, teaching numbers of things, but developed this course at Keene. You'll hear that she also has inspired the creation of a community service, actually it's beyond community service group, called Be the Change, that a group of her students in the death class started on their own one weekend by spending their own time and money and effort to sort of renovate a hospice that they had visited on one of their field trips. And now it's grown into a very large organization that serves not only community service in numbers of ways, but also is involved in social justice issues, going to disaster relief places and things like that. In 2013, she was the Outstanding Human Rights Educator, recipient of an award from the Keene Human Rights Institute. I'll read you one quote from her that's not actually in the book in this way, although it appears in various ways, but it's from her blog. But it summarizes a lot of what her approach is and a lot of what the book is trying to do, although in a very innovative and creative way. She says, The only thing we can change is our attitude about death. We can learn about it. We can plan for it. We can talk to our loved ones about it. We can live our lives the way they should be lived. All of this takes inordinate amounts of courage because death is scary. Living takes courage too. If we can respect death as inevitable instead of ignoring it for as long as we can before the health problems set in, we can live with renewed sense of passion and wonder. And that's, as I said, kind of an underlying theme all the way through the book, although it appears in many different ways. Erika Hayasaki is a highly awarded and recognized literary journalist who had a long career on the Los Angeles Times, has won numerous awards for her narrative nonfiction. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is. This is her first book. She's written many stories that are anthologized and are actually taught. I actually used to teach one of them before I retired. A story that she wrote, became quite famous for, about the shootings at Virginia Tech back in 2007, focusing on what happened in one particular room in Norris Hall, where 12 students and their beloved French teacher were killed. And she focused on that. I remember the story very well. As I said, I used to teach that story. She's won numbers of other kinds of awards for her writing and has written for very many freelance opportunities, magazines, top magazines, and so forth. She now actually is a professor in the English department at the University of California, Irvine, where she teaches narrative journalism and related kinds of things. She got involved in this book, or wanting to do this book, in a couple of different ways. Excuse me. One was after the Virginia Tech experience, when she was sitting in her apartment, or in her newsroom actually, in New York, when the shooting news broke, and a few hours later she was at Virginia Tech there after being flown and there very quickly. And it was for her, as well as everyone else involved, and for many other reporters, a quite unsettling and traumatic experience. So she went back, and after things sort of settled down and is always looking for good stories and good ideas, she began to think a lot about death. And she had seen it in such a horrific way. And so she started doing sort of Google search on just death. And in the way a reporter's mind works, kind of one thing will lead you to two other things, and two other ideas will lead you to four more ideas, and so forth. She began to build over the course of some time, and then she happened on the idea of death education. She began to think, oh, well, how is death being taught in colleges and so forth? And she was searching for that, and then the New York City area, and Norma Beau's name popped up on that search. She contacted her, and then spent the next 4 years, basically, with her, sometimes intensely for long periods of times, and other times over the 4 years, the big gaps of time and so forth. Norma agreed to let her write about her, Norma, and the work in the course and so forth, but she required that Erika take the course herself, not as a graded student, but she had to sit in the course, come every class meeting, go to all the field trips, do all the other things. This became very relevant because it brought to the forefront for Erika that she had to deal with a significant loss in her own life when she was 16 at a high school in Linwood, Washington. And it happened to be on the day of the Oklahoma City bombing in April of 1995. On that particular day, her beloved friend named Sangeeta was murdered in the early morning by a much older guy, like his 21 or 22, who was infatuated with her and something of a stalker. And she was trying to get rid of him and break away, and thought she had. And then her mother had left early for work, and Sangeeta was alone in her apartment early in the morning. And the guy broke in, and she actually went out into a parking lot, and she was actually murdered in the parking lot. And then the sick guy broke back into the apartment and went into her room and killed himself. horrific story. And this obviously was something that struck her. It actually became one of her impetuses for going into journalism. She wrote a story about this for the school newspaper that the principal and everyone else was upset about because it was such a good piece of detailed journalism. So she had that there in her background and immediately got into the course. And one of the very first assignments that students do in the course is to write a goodbye letter. Write a goodbye letter to someone who has left, that you are missing, someone who has died in some way. And she suddenly found herself facing a blank screen, I guess, to write it, and needing to write a goodbye letter to Sanjita. So she had this own connection to herself. She did not have the kind of horrific childhoods that Norma herself had and others had. She didn't have that part of it, but she certainly had this long-standing murder of her best friend there, and she dealt with it periodically. I would say that throughout the book, Erika, it appears, she writes in first person sometimes, and she has her own little anecdotes here and there, but at a very much of a minimum. She very much wants other people to sort of tell their own stories. So she spent, as I said, about 4 years following Norma around, talking to her at length. It took about a year before Norma began to finally open up to her about her own story, her own childhood. And Norma invited Erika to go with her on a couple of very significant trips to revisit places in her childhood and deal with the deaths and losses in her own various ways. So they became quite close for that reason, for Erika in sort of an immersion into this kind of a program. So a couple of ideas about, or just to give you a sense of what we're talking about with narrative journalism. It comes from a long history of literary journalism, actually from the 19th century as it developed and modernized through the 20th century. At a time in the 19th century, later part of the 19th century, a lot of journalists, mostly men, but surprisingly a number of women that might surprise you, the number getting involved, who often saw journalism as a young person's kind of pursuit to learn about life in order so you could then leave journalism and write your novels and plays and poetry and other kinds of things. It drew those literary types. And through modernizing through the 20th century, it became something quite different until the 1960s when there was this movement called New Journalism, mostly in New York City and in the magazines, and then spreading throughout. After that, brought a lot of young literary type journalists involved. That evolved into another name, back to the original literary journalism, the narrative journalism, creative nonfiction. And basically what all of that is talking about, and it isn't like every stage was radically different from the other, they're kind of all intersecting. I'll just read you a couple of quotes here. Storytelling journalism, another popular term, employs the techniques of fiction: point of view, time, scene, which includes setting, characters, and dialogue, and narrative. Yet, it remains true to the tenets of journalism: accuracy, honesty, integrity of intentions. Narrative does not usually tell the reader about the story, as traditionalists do, but novelists and screenwriters do. That is, the narrative writer reveals the story so the reader watches and come to the reader's own conclusion about the significance of the events as they've occurred and what they have meant in people's lives. Someone else says, narrative means any technique that produces the visceral desire in the reader to want to know what happened next. Someone said once, every good story is a mystery story. And certainly that's a good part of the narrative journalism, to sort of keep people trying to figure out, to get an answer to the basic question, what happened? What happens next? In fact, one of the techniques that Erika uses in this, in addition to just very thorough reporting of all kinds, everything is verified, everything is reported, everyone is named with their real name here, except for one person, a student of hers named Israel. who was a pretty serious gangbanger for quite a while, and things happened, and he left that life, was able to, and he is the only one who has a pseudonym, but everyone else is fully named, and you can look them up if their full name is there. She's been an inordinate amount of times reading volumes of material. She took voluminous notes, tape recordings, spent a lot of times, a lot of the anecdotes that she described she was witnessing to, like she went on all the students in one class went back to Virginia Tech for a memorial service, and she went along with them on that trip. So, I mean, she had a number of first-hand experiences. Where she did not, though, she would use what's called narrative reconstruction. So she would talk to the people actually involved in this incident and get as many different views of so what happened, what was said, what were your feelings like. She has especially in a lot of the dramatic instances, she says that I employed narrative reconstruction where there were no additional documents or additional witnesses. When that happened, I relied on the recollections of the main person involved and chose to include memories connected to highly emotional charged experiences, as studies have shown that those are the memories our minds tend to preserve. It made me think of a quote by Anne Sexton. I used to teach a lot about memory in narrative nonfiction. That's a very key, as it is throughout this book. Anne Sexton said once, "It doesn't matter who my father was. It matters who I remember he was." Right? You get that difference. It doesn't really matter, and you can look up factually what he was. How do I remember it? So that was why she was emphasizing this narrative reconstruction of these people, and what did they remember about this incident? That seems to be a key for them. She uses a lot of technique of what is called suspended interest along this idea of kind of mystery writing. So several times she will create scenes. A lot of the book is written through scenes, all right, as well as your own development of ideas and talking about what's going on. A lot of dialogue, a lot of great description. I'll read you briefly a description she has of Norma in a couple of ways. One of the suspended interest techniques, though, is to have a scene going on and then stopping. It's sort of like before the commercial, okay, in one of your favorite shows. You know, there's always something at the very end, and then it stops, and you have to wait another 2 minutes before you go back. Or a season finale of your favorite show that leaves you hanging until the fall and all that sort of thing. It's the same kind of technique. And she has those. I'm going to read you very briefly one of them about a student of hers, not one of the major characters, but a young woman. Actually, her daughter had known in high school and then became homeless and had a pretty bad life after that. She had, I'm not going to read the whole thing, it's too long, but basically the students was trying to reach out to her. They became quite close. Norma, throughout the book, found a lot of students who gravitated toward her with their own kinds of difficult stories because of her own life. And for many of them, not for every student who was there, for many of them she would go above and beyond the normal connection she would have in meeting these students a lot. Sometimes at any time of the day or night at a local Applebee's is where she met one of the students, and others for a time, and to talk about their lives and help them through crisis. She became quite involved. At one point, Erika says to her, you know, so you're roughly, she says, so you're just always the nurse, aren't you? And Norma replied, yes, and you're always the journalist, aren't you? You know, but she would get very, very involved. So this young student, Isis, was trying to reach her and kept calling, could not get a call back, and is worried about it. Maybe she's abandoning me, and maybe she's not going to connect with me anymore. And then Erika ends that little scene by pointing out neither Isis nor any of your other students would know that at that point EMTs were rushing to an accident that Norma had been involved in, a car accident. And then it stops, and 17 pages later it picks up with the accident. One of the most dramatic involves Israel in his gang-banging life when he comes to a certain point where he's broken into a house with some others and beaten up various people there because they're after one guy who had, in another gang who had done something about them. And he says, I will read this one point because this is quite dramatic. He says, how had he gotten here? How did this happen to him? Israel's life from childhood to now had been one rapid ride of misfortune, wrong turns, and bad decisions. It had all led Israel to this moment, one that would surely change his life forever, transform him from teenage boy into teenage killer. His hands steadied around the metal of the gun. All it would take was one shot. And in this scene, Israel had been literally standing over a boy with his gun in his face. The scene stops, right? About 7 or 8 pages later, the scene picks up again. So she does this throughout, this kind of suspended interest, which is very effective to keep you kind of reading and wanting to go forth. She also uses a lot of metaphors. So one thing stands for another. One of the most, and I think the most thematic, and one I will describe a little bit later, about the rhizome. Do you know what this is? I'm not a botanist, I'm not much of a scientist. But it's basically the way that she uses it is about the roots and the nutrients and everything being used to keep the roots alive while something blossoms, but the blossom goes away, and yet the roots continue to live for the next season. I'm summarizing. Basically, the excerpt I'll read says it much better. But this becomes a very, very important metaphor for basically a lot of what the book is about. I'll read you very briefly a description. She also uses a lot of what we call revelatory detail. So there's a lot of telling detail. Just I'm telling you what someone looks like or what the class is like or this or that. And then there's revelatory kind of detail. Here's a brief excerpt from her early on where we meet Norma, and she drives up with a minivan full of students, and Erika describes the bumper sticker, "America needs a woman president." All around there are Doritos bags unopened. There are magic markers, a dozen stuffed purple bunnies, a Celtic Thunder CD, the soundtrack of Hairspray, and clusters of straws sealed in paper wrapping. And she burst out of there like a fairy godmother before her students, and she says they're visiting a road trip to a cemetery. And she said, "There's nothing like a good cemetery, right?" She says, rounding everyone up. She had long brassy hair that usually wore down, like today, or a high ponytail when it fizzled in humidity. Her eyes changed colors in the light like speckled brown jade. Her skin was flushed in the face, more suntan on her arms and chest with a spattering of freckles. Her underactive thyroid made it easy for her to gain weight and hard to lose it, and she barely ate with her nonstop schedule, subsisting on unsweetened iced Dunkin' Donuts lattes. She was pear-shaped and pretty, with a sturdy frame that locked her soft edges into place. During non-work days, she dressed folksy, long flowing skirts, Walker sandals, turquoise and silver jewelry, and trinkets the color of bones. At work, she sometimes dressed as if she might be called to attend a funeral at any moment, which happened occasionally. Black skirts, black dresses, black stockings, black heels. For color, she'd add a bright scarf. So there's a lot of specific detail, the iced lattes and so forth, but there's also this revelatory kind of, normally she would dress this way, but she would always carry with her a kind of uniform, being called to go out to a funeral or something else quite on the spur of the moment. Another very quick example, not as long as this one, she would, for 2 weeks before and around her birthday, before the start of the fall semester, she would go away by herself to a cabin in New Hampshire. She did this throughout her life. A lot of this was because of the terrible upbringing she had had with violent household arguments, a father who it turns out was in organized crime, a mother who was distant, who actually made it clear often that she did not want Erika when her mother was 17-year-old and unmarried. She had no prenatal care. She wore girdles to hide try to hide. There's a number of things. And Erika grew up with quite a lot of difficulties of all particular kinds. She said sometimes lessons needed to be examined beyond textbooks in the lives and cycles of everyday people. Her intuition led her to damaged people because she had once felt damaged herself. So, it's again that sort of revelatory insight made by the reporter in this case, after spending a lot of time with her and knowing and understanding the story, and sort of explains, this is why. And the book focuses on so many of the students, Caitlin, Jonathan, Josh, Israel are the main ones, who all have horrific childhood stories that involve usually a lot of common things: violence, abuse of all kinds, emotional and otherwise, murder, suicide, addiction, mental illness. These are all common strains in various ways through there, including the story of two brothers who actually witnessed their father brutally murdering their mother in the kitchen, and then him putting them in the car and driving faster and faster and faster until he stomped on the brake and spun out and crashed into a bridge, trying to kill him and themselves. They all survived. It was only later that the sons read a story that they had not seen before that said that he actually had killed his mother and was trying to kill them because they thought there was going to be an alien invasion and takeover. And there's a whole strain of mental illness through there. So, it's one of those little insights of her, as kind of her intuition was to attract, to understand these people, and they were attracted to her in the same way. And that's what the book is about, a lot of those stories. So it's Norma, if you can imagine, is a large magnet. And a lot of these other stories kind of magnetized to her and drawn to her in their own sorts of ways. And sometimes that can be seeming to be a digression, especially the first one that appears at some length is the Caitlin story. OCD, again, violence in the serious OCD and the violence in the home. Her mother, who makes so many suicide attempts that you can't even count them in the book. And it's always poor Caitlin as a child and as a teenager and then a college student who's off to save her mother. She's constantly going to the hospital to be with her mother who tried to kill herself and so forth and so on. And that can be a bit digressive because the Caitlin story goes on and on and on for a long time, and begin to think, well, okay, but where's the death class part of this? It's Caitlin's story. And then you begin to realize it's Caitlin, and then again with the Israel or the Jonathan and Josh story, and then Caitlin and Jonathan and Josh become a unit themselves with the Jonathan and Caitlin's relationship. And then you begin to realize, this course was called Death in Perspective. And those are the two key words, is death, but with a lot of different perspective. And throughout all of these stories, it becomes clear in numbers of ways that a lot of what Norma is about, and a lot of what the book turns to be about, is, first of all, trying to help these damaged young people love themselves first, but also that they can't save everyone. They have no obligation, but they cannot save everyone, no matter what the horrific stories are from their own childhoods, and saying that eventually they have to take care of themselves, and then they'll be able to help others. And Norma stands as that example. When she was not sure she was ever going to survive her childhood or teen years, and then through the influence of a grandmother, the solitary figure who sort of over some time taught her to survive by loving her. Norma makes a point of saying at some point that she would go to restaurants with her parents, again, the organized crime guy, and this mother who had her own very serious issues and would make no hesitancy to remind Norma how much she did not want Norma in the first place and tried not to have her and so forth. So she would go to restaurants and look around and say, I don't understand these other people. They seem happy. You know, what is a happy family life like? And then have to go back. And she found a way to survive, and she found a way to, in some ways, even go to an extreme in trying to save others, or at least to help others save themselves. So it becomes a story of kind of survival, redemption, resolution in a number of ways, but again, all about death in so many different ways that it appears. All of the stories are about, there are even some minor characters, so to speak. One of the field trips is the Northern State Prison in New Jersey, maximum security prison in New Jersey, overcrowded, all those issues. And she meets a guy there named Carl, who had committed a senseless, as he would be anyway, a murder in his youth in Camden, New Jersey. He and a pal killed a guy because he thought the guy had money in his trunk, $12,000 from an inheritance. It turns out that he didn't have the money, and Carl is in prison the rest of his life. So Carl becomes a Buddhist in prison, teaches Buddhism classes, organizes these field trips from Norma, convinces Norma and the prison administration to start teaching classes in the prison, and does that to some extent. There are a couple of others, including one of the most poignant and important ones near the end of the book, involves a man named Jerzy, J-E-R-Z-Y, who was the husband of the French teacher who was killed at Virginia Tech in room 211 with 12 students. Excuse me, and herself. And so he becomes I say minor only because he doesn't get like the 30 or 40 pages these other stories do, but he becomes very important for sort of what he connects and teaches them and talks about, and on their field trip, and how that becomes important. I will say that what is one thing I found missing, and I'm not saying it's necessarily a criticism or the book is weak because of it, but one thing that is missing, or there are 24 students or so in this class every semester. There's a 3-year waiting list to get into this class. It's the second most popular class among undergraduates of all at Keene University. You might be able to guess what the most popular class for undergraduates at Keene would be. What? Sexuality. Human sexuality. Human sexuality and death in perspective. Like, that's got to say something there. So there are two dozen or others, and she only writes about, again at length, Caitlin, Jonathan, Josh, and Israel, and then some to a lesser extent, Isis and the others. So I found myself thinking about, well, what's the class like for all these other students who are going through it? It's a traditional class in some ways. There are some readings. There's a textbook, something like Death in Society and the Human Condition. They read Tuesday with Morrie. Okay, they read some other books like that. There are some lectures she gives. In fact, very early in the book, there's a 4-page section taken from the class, where she's lecturing to them, I think in their first class, about just what the process of dying is. What's actually happening in the body, speaking as a nurse, in a non-traumatic injury, not a sudden death, but just in a person dying in the last few days, and maybe on comfort care or something. And she describes that in 4 pages. That's really informative and interesting, and explains every single thing. And it may help me realize I've been a chaplain at Albany Med, and now part-time and volunteering. So even as much time I've spent there, it kind of informed and helped me say, oh, I understand more about what is actually happening at these stages. So it's that also, but it's also a matter of various field trips that the students take to a cemetery, to a hospice, to a funeral home, to, in fact, there was another one she decided to add after this book a visit to a crematorium. And just in visiting in numbers of ways, the different kinds of aspects of death and dying and bereavement. So they would go out for that. And then there are these writing assignments, so like 15 to 17 or so writing assignments. The goodbye, I'm not going to go through them all, but these are some of them. The goodbye letter, the rewind button, sort of rewind your life and go back to a certain point and play it over again. Become a ghost which actually, when I first heard about that, I thought it meant like, oh, go back to a scene in your life and just kind of observe it. But she meant literally now, for a period of time, maybe it's 12 hours, say nothing, right? Just observe, sit, listen, don't interact, don't do anything. Just be, right, as it goes, which is kind of fascinating. The reaction to visiting a hospice, that she made them write about the death penalty after they visited death row inmates at Northern State. And she had them write a fire story, which turns out to be the time that you walked through the fire, the hardest time in your life. Write about that. And again, Erika would have to write all of these. She doesn't include all of her own writings, Erika, but she does in some. So it leads me back to the point that what I found sort of missing throughout all this, well, what about those other 22 students in the class who were just kind of average, so to speak, normal college students, all of whom have had death in their lives in various ways. Almost every semester I taught, at least not every, but almost every other semester at least, there would be one or more students who were experiencing death in that time. I went back in the spring to teach 2 classes just because there were people on leave and they asked me to come back and so forth. And sure enough, I taught 2 classes, and in one of them there was a young student who was going through a very difficult experience of losing her mother right before the class started. So what about all these students? And there's nothing really said about what they're getting out of the class or what they dealt with. She didn't really interview any of them. Although in the Simon & Schuster news video, there is a little clip that just one student who says, the class is Life 101. Which I like because it turns out to be this class and even the subtitle of the book, a true story about life. So it turns out to be, yes, this is a death class, it's a book about the death class, but it turns out more to be about life, about how to live your life, she uses a framework, Erikson's stages of life, Erik Erikson's, maybe some of you go through various stages, 8 stages. But she uses that, Bo uses that as a kind of a framework for her teaching, and Hayasaki uses it too, to sort of, as you progress through life, you should be learning something so that when you go to the next stage, you can bring that with you, accumulative, till you get to the later years of your life, and then be able to face the last years or a death with much more wisdom and much more hopefulness and much more satisfaction, and not helplessness and frustration and loss and so forth. It's the ideal. But their idea is that you keep moving, you learn from your experiences, you grow, and then eventually you learn to give back and you grow more and so forth and so on. So as I said, she doesn't really address what those other students, how they fit into all that schematic. Strictly by coincidence, I do 1 to 2 overnight shifts a month at Albany Medical Center. It's a 24/7 pastoral care service. There's an overnight shift that goes from 5 on Monday afternoon, when I did it, until 8 the next morning. It's a 15-hour shift where you're the only chaplain in the hospital. And it's not all doom and gloom. Let me say that too. It's not just all 15 hours of the worst possible thing. On the other hand, it can go from extremes. And on Monday night, there were 3 deaths that I had to deal with. A bit more than usual. Some shifts there are none at all. But it just struck me that all 3 deaths were radically different in any number of ways. And not only involving the person who died, but the people around them. A loving, bonded family who was well in tune with each other, dealt with it in various ways. Someone else who barely had anyone there, and family members who would not come to the hospital because they had long-standing rivalries and so forth and so on. And then a third, I can't go into much detail obviously, but it struck me in thinking about this, and they were all, and I don't mean this to be condescending, but they were not the Caitlin and the other stories. They didn't have those kinds of stories that I knew of. I wouldn't get into their whole story, but they were us, okay? And the people that they were just people dealing with the death in the hospital, and as I said, in radically different ways. And maybe think about, so we're sort of out of this book in terms of what what she's addressing. Now, I understand that from a journalistic standpoint to some extent. Journalists get very bored with, or at least they're not attracted to status quo. Nothing happens, that's not news, right? News is a change in the status quo. I'm summarizing generally here. It's something different, it's something unexpected, it's something out of the ordinary. We might do another session about just the fallacies of that and how it can be extreme and how it can be unfair and sensationalistic and all of that. That's a different issue. But I'm just saying, from a journalistic mindset is, well, the status quo is what everybody knows, and there's nothing unexpected or nothing new in that. I don't agree with that, but there's nothing new in that. So I understand her approach in that is because they make these great stories, the Caitlin and the others' stories, but I'm not really criticizing her for that either. I think it might have been some digression if she had to address everything in that way. But I did feel sort of that I would like to sort of get some sense of what these others. But the stories are so powerful, and Norma's dealing with the stories of reclamation and survival and death. It began to realize as we go through these long stories, death is on every page in numbers of ways. He's dealing with death as a part of life in that way. Let me end with with one or a couple of comments, and I will read one final thing that come through the book in terms of themes. One was this: love yourself. You have to be able to take care of yourself. You have to be able to survive before you can actually take care of others and help them survive and indeed love them. That's a very constant theme that Erika states in numbers of ways, and that Norma and the students come to state. As I said, with Caitlin and Jonathan, you can track their stories after these episodes. These are a few years ago, 5 years ago and more. And you can find out about them and see how they have survived beyond. Caitlin went into psychology, got a master's, and this year she should be finishing her PhD in psychology and counseling and addiction help and so forth. Jonathan has a career in real estate and financial consulting and things, and there are other kinds of things. You can sort of track those stories. So that was a major one. The other thing, one of the other is this Be the Change organization. Her students went on a weekend, or went during the week, during the class, to visit a hospice, and they were kind of appalled by this sort of not well taken care of hospice in one of the large cities in New Jersey. It was in disrepair, it needed help, and the students decided to get together. They spent their own money, they got donations, volunteers. They showed up one weekend, spent the whole weekend painting, repairing, putting in donated furniture, doing everything for that hospice, and it made a tremendous difference. And out of that grew this organization called Be the Change, which you can read about at BeTheChangeNJ.org. The NJ for New Jersey, BeTheChangeNJ.org. It's become a large service kind of organization. As I said earlier, it deals with natural disasters, deals with memorials, community gardens, community service. It deals with a lot. It's become quite a large organization that does represent one of these major themes. And then I think one of the other themes that is best summarized, I think, by this rhizome metaphor, and this will be the last thing that I do here for this. And this comes from an interview, or it comes when the students go to Virginia Tech for a memorial about the shootings there that were in 2007. So this is just a few years after that. And there's a program down there, and there's a new center that's opening there that is being run by Jersey, the husband of this French teacher who was killed. And so there's a lot of events, and she takes them on a road trip down there. Erika goes along. And so this comes from Erika's interview with Jersey, but also what he's telling the students. He says, plants are not solitary organisms. Their capacity to withstand stress is heavily dependent on their interactions with other organisms in the rhizosphere, the zone that surrounds their roots. The bleeding heart, for example, the plant, dies in midsummer and stays dormant until the following spring, but its essence lives on underground. The plant's seeds have been born in pods where they absorbed water within the earth, flourishing into an intricate underground life system known as the rhizome. Part of this main stem bursts through the surface of Earth in warm months, creating leaflets that absorb water and carbon dioxide from sunlight. Those elements transform into sugar that the bleeding heart, like most life, needs to survive, while releasing a byproduct, oxygen, which we need to survive, into the air. As the plant matures, the heart-shaped petals blossom, ready to spread their seed to the next generation. The bloom will stay visible for a single season. Meanwhile, underground, the rhizome is storing nutrients for the winter and working for the benefit of the community, sending sugar into the soil that surrounds it, on which microbes like bacteria feast. In return, bacteria help the flower survive, absorbing nitrogen from the soil and turning it into fertilizer to create a stronger, more resilient plant. And then she ends with a quote from Carl Jung in Memories, Dreams, and Reflection. Life has always seemed to me like a plant that lives on its rhizome. Its true life is invisible, hidden in the rhizome. What we see is the blossom which passes. The rhizome remains. So like any good journalist who's constantly looking for metaphors and really a sort of essential thematic metaphor, that's it for what this book is about. About a class of 24 students and a professor with a syllabus and assignments and lectures as just the beginning for something that goes far beyond that, about life and death as part of life. Okay?